Hello, Drugel here, and today I'm going to show you how we can implement an animation in Raylib. We are going to need a character. I recommend you get some free one on itch.io. I have my own one, so I will be using that one. In Visual Studio, we are going to switch to the folder view, and in here we are going to create a new folder named Assets. We will put our character sprite sheet into the Assets folder. When I will be writing the code, I will simply explain what it does, and after we have everything we need, I will explain it more in depth. Let's start with the coding. We are going to need a struct. I will call it animation setup. And here we are going to need a texture, 2D. This will be our sprite sheet. Next will be an integer for frames wide. This is how many frames we will have on the sprite sheet. Next, we are going to need an integer for frames tall. That's how many rows are there on the sprite sheet. Next, we are going to need a float for frames width. That's how wide is one frame, and float for frames height. That's how tall is one frame from the sprite sheet. Next is a integer current frame. This is storing what frame we are currently drawing. This can be at 0. We are starting at 0. Next is an integer for anim row. This determines which row we are going to draw. Next is float anim speed. This is animation speed, how quickly does the animation run. Next and last is a float named timer. This will proceed through our animation. With that, we are going to do another struct that is called sprite. Here we need a rectangle called source rec and rectangle called dest rec. And last is float scale. This will determine the size of the sprite. Next will be a function. So let's start void animate. We will accept two parameters. First will be animation setup pointer called anim setup, and the second one will be a rectangle pointer called source rec. Let's start with the animation logic. So we will do anim setup pointing to its timer. We will increment it by get frame time. If the anim setup timer is bigger or equal to anim setup that animation speed, we will reset the anim setup timer, and we will increment the current frame. Next, we will do an if statement. If the animation setup current frame is bigger or equal to the animation setup frames wide, we will reset the current frame to 0. Next, we will set up the source rectangle. So source rec x will be float anim setup dot current frame. we'll multiply it by anim setup frame width. Let's do the same for the y-axis. Y here will be anim row and frames height. Let's go through the animation setup struct and explain what each variable does in detail. The texture 2D sprite sheet is our sprite sheet. I have it here next to the code. Frames wide is how many frames does the sprite sheet has. Frames tall is how tall is the sprite sheet, how many rows does it have. Frame width is how wide is one frame from the sprite sheet. Frame height is height of one frame from the sprite sheet. Current frame starting at 0 is the first frame from the sprite sheet. Anim row is which row we are going to be animating. And anim speed is for the speed of the animation, and timer is used for the animation speed setup. Simple idea behind this animate function is that we are just incrementing the current frame by the timer, and the current frame is moving our source through the animation, moving its X position. Then when it reaches the frames wide number specified by us, it resets to 0 and goes into a loop. That should be all the animation logic we need. Now let's initialize the sprite sheet and draw the animation. We will start here in the main method and with initializing the animation setup. Let's call it the idle anim and initialize it empty. Let's do idle anim sprite sheet, and we will initialize it with the load texture function, and we will use our sprite sheet here. Let's do path to assets, character, sprite sheet.png. Next we do idle anim dot frames wide will be 4. We do idle anim dot frames tall, we do 2. Next we do idle anim dot anim row. We will be animating the first row, so 1. Idle anim dot current frame will be 0, just to be sure. Then we do idle anim timer. We start at 0. Also, before this, we do idle anim dot anim speed. Let's start with 0.5. Next will be idle anim dot frame width. That will equal a float. Idle anim dot sprite sheet width divided by idle anim dot frames wide. Next we will do idle anim dot frame height. This will equal float. Idle anim dot sprite sheet dot height divided by dot frames tall. Now let's initialize the sprite. Let's call it player. Initialize it empty. Player dot scale will be, let's do 2 for now. Player dot source rec will be 0.0 on the X and 0.0 on the Y. Then we do idle anim frame width and idle anim frame height. Next, we will do the player destination rec. This will be a bigger one, so we will split it into more lines. Let's get the screen width. We will divide it by 2. It's a function minus the idle anim frame width multiplied by the player scale divided by 2. Next, we will get the screen height divided by 2 minus idle anim frame height multiplied by player scale, also divided by 2. For the width and height, we will do idle anim frame width multiplied by player scale and idle anim frame height multiplied by player scale. Before we forget, we need to unload the texture. So let's put unload here. And we will do the idle anim sprite sheet. I will show you a way how to clean this up a little bit. We will click on include. We will add a new file. It will be called types.h and also a new file here. It will be called animation.cpp. Okay, let's start with the types. We will include Raylib.h and we will copy both of our structs and put them here. Now we also need to include the types here, our newly created file. So we can use everything here. Now let's copy our animation function and paste it into our animation.cpp file. Don't need it here anymore. And let's copy the header and paste it here with the semicolon at the end. Also here we will include types.h and that should be it. We also need to add our types.h file to our header files in the project. So let's click on header files, add existing item and types.h. And also we need to add our newly created animation C++ file to our project as well. Let's click on animation, add, save. Next we will go to the while loop to use our function animate, a reference to idle anim and a reference to our player, our source rec. Next we will go to our drawing section and draw the texture pro. So let's use idle anim sprite sheet. Let's use player source. Let's use player destrec. Origin we can do 0 0 and 0.0. Rotation also 0.0 and color will be white. That should be all. Now let's switch to the project, click game and build. Build succeeded. Let's open our game and see if it animates. Yes, it does. And this is our sprite that is currently idling. Perfect.